Now, for an in-depth look at the issues facing startups in conflict regions, we welcome Zubair Iqbal, Adjunct Scholar at the Middle East Institute. He's also the former IMF Deputy Director of Central Asia and the Middle East. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Now, what would you say are some of the financial benefits of investing in some of these startups in war-torn countries?
Well, you see, the financial benefits are quite obvious because the returns are very high, at least in the short run. And the required investment and expenditure isn't that large. Given the circumstances in many of these places and given the shallowness of the market, startups can actually go in and establish themselves fairly quickly and meet the very, very basic demand that exists. And sort of, it's a demand that exists irrespective of whether there's a conflict or not. But because of conflict, there are no other sources available to meet this demand. So these people, the startups, can go in and do it. Their costs are very low. They know the region, they know the locality, they know the needs. And so they're in a position to meet those needs much more efficiently than elsewhere.
Now, as we heard in the package before, some people are facing that choice between, do I start a business at home amid all this crisis, or do I, for the sake of safety, take my ideas elsewhere? What do you think about that?
No, that's a very interesting issue. The reason is the following. It depends upon what point of conflict you are at. If it's a conflict which is in the process of resolution, or there is expectation that it's going to be resolved fairly quickly, or in the foreseeable future, then it's in your interest to invest over there, because then you're in a position to benefit once the peace starts to dawn, as you may call it. However, if the uncertainty is so significant that you cannot expect it to become normal in the short run or even the medium term, then you would like to go elsewhere. For example, rather than investing in Damascus, you might like to go and invest in Dubai.
Right. Now, in terms of the programs that are in place to help these startups grow, whether it's in their home country or people emigrating for safety reasons, are there any big programs in place? Like, has the IMF reached out, or the United Nations, to try and include that as maybe part of their funding for countries?
Not really. You see, the IMF doesn't do that in any case because IMF funding is for macroeconomic purposes and not for specific projects. World Bank would do it. I don't think World Bank has done much of that either. Quite a bit of this funding has actually come from the private sector or from the NGOs. And the purpose underlying that was to take advantage of the skills that existed on a short-term basis, number one, and on small-scale basis, to establish a foundation to go on. And that's how it has happened.
Now, what are some of the dilemmas that businesses face when they're trying to invest in these conflict regions?
Oh, there are significant ones. You see, remember, there are 3 or 4 very critical variables that determine whether investment in startups will take place or not. One of those is how transparent is the system? What's the regulatory practices in the place? Are they very oppressive, or are they investment friendly? And the third issue is, are skills available? If skills are not available, nothing else will happen. Should the skills be available, under those circumstances, if regulations are friendly, and if venture capital and other sources of funding are made available to them, then you can expect these things to catch on. For example, this is what's happening right now in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has established a special fund for venture capital purposes. They're going to use local resources and local skills, liberalize regulation, and thus allow these ventures to develop into e-commerce and provide the services that are needed over there.
Now, obviously, if there's that demand for it, sometimes there can be a stigma that if you're investing in these war-torn countries, that you're kind of taking advantage of people at the worst possible time. Do you think there is that stigma, and what can be done in terms of keeping a good reputation as a business?
Oh, well, look, the stigma is a very interesting issue. It's in the eye of the beholder. I don't see that being a very significant variable. However, this is true that a foreign investor going in and supporting domestic startup activity will have to think twice as to whether they want to have their names sullied or not. As I said earlier, in case the conflict is about to be resolved, or there is a process through which it's going to be resolved, then it's in the interest of foreigners as well as domestic investors to participate and establish these startups.
Now, are there any countries in the regions, would you say, that are getting it right in terms of providing the tools? and the right environment for startups?
Well, in the Middle East, I think Jordan and Morocco come to mind. Because both of these countries have had fairly comprehensive reforms to go into effect, and therefore they have become liberalized, and they've got resources coming in, and there is confidence that they are going to make it. Tunisia is another case. Other countries are the natural candidates for this kind of investment, which will include the UAE, other GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, particularly Dubai and the UAE, et cetera, Bahrain. Difficulties are in places where there is an active conflict, like Egypt, Tunisia, and Yemen.
Now, we only have time for just one more question here, but I'd like to ask, in terms of the rebuilding process, how big of a role do you think startups could really have?
Not that significant. Look, let's face it. First of all, they're a very small segment of the economy, number one. Number two, there are limited resources that go into it. Number three, they do not really actually produce goods. They help produce goods. So they are basically providing services to produce goods in the economy. And therefore, their contribution is meaningful, but not dramatic.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.